It is extremely difficult to imagine our civilization without the legacy of the Roman Empire. Without Roman law. Without the Latin language used in medicine and jurisprudence. Without the books of Virgil and Tacitus. Without Julius Caesar, finally. And yet, Rome could have perished twice long before the empire came into being. Hannibal had a good chance of ending the Roman Republic, but he was let down by lack of supplies, funding and replenishment of recruits. Rome survived and emerged from the war as the strongest power in the Mediterranean. But the real disaster broke out just 33 years after the destruction of Carthage. Scipio Aemilianus. And no Hannibal with Gasdrubaloum could not compare with the threat that fell on the Republic from the north. Perhaps the only time in the history of the pre-Christian world, Rome faced the threat of total destruction. And the cause of such could be not civilized Carthaginians and not largely Romanized barbarians, well acquainted with classical culture, and the most real savages, another word cannot pick up. Let us try to understand what kind of unbridled, desperately brave and numerous people defied the Republic and almost deprived us of the ancient heritage. And how Rome coped with this deadly danger. When we speak of the indestructible army of ancient Rome, we always imagine legions of fearless and disciplined soldiers under the command of talented and cunning commanders. Clasping shields, scutum Romans' unstoppable march across Europe, Africa and Asia, conquering kingdoms and bringing peoples to obedience. Not only, and even not so much, gladi and pilums were their weapons, as excellent combat training and strict discipline. And, of course, the belief in their own invincibility. That is, everything that was completely deprived of the barbarians inhabiting the European forests. The established image as a whole does not require much adjustment. No one questions the strength and good organization of the Roman army, and even more so its combat merits. The territory of the empire in the best of times included remote Britain. Under Augustus the legions reached the Elbe. And by the reign of Titus Flavius, the great state subordinated to its jurisdiction even Mesopotamia and southern Egypt up to the Sudan. However, we should not forget that on the account of Rome were both great victories and crushing defeats. But all these conquests belong to later times, when the Roman army acquired a familiar look to most readers. The aforementioned military catastrophe of the Republic and a series of severe defeats in the Cimbral War were the impetus for a radical reform of the army, as a result of which it acquired the image that has become famous through the ages. The events we are describing took place at the end of the 2nd century BC. By this time the army of the Roman Republic was already considered practically invincible, but the principle of forming legions was inevitably becoming obsolete. According to traditions going back to the reign of the legendary Servius Tullius, the Republic did not have a standing army. It was assembled according to property values when there was a threat of war. The census was determined by the landed property of a citizen of Rome. City dwellers were considered as an additional population and did not have the right to serve on a par with the poor peasantry. Here it should be separately noted that the common words, honorable duty, go back to the times of Rome, because only and exclusively citizens could serve in the army. And those who did not serve could not subsequently occupy elective and public offices. Perhaps this approach was justified as long as Rome remained a predominantly agrarian state. Population growth, the growing importance of cities and craft centers, the ruin of the peasantry. All this was definitely not in favor of the military machine. In addition, soldiers provided themselves with armor and weapons, which led to differences in equipment. There was no centralized state supply under the Republic. Despite this, by 120 BC, Rome was very successfully waging a war of conquest, driving the Gauls northward. The province of Narbonne Gaul was established in the south of modern France, from the Pyrenees to the Western Alps. At the same time, the armies of the Republic moved northeast toward the Danube and even took part in the wars of North Africa, primarily because of the unheard-of fertility of the African lands, now turned into desert. At that time, North Africa had a much milder and more humid climate and could feed the ever-increasing Italian population with cheap bread. The storm struck suddenly and with all-consuming power. On the northern borders, in the Alps, on the Rhine and in Gaul, an untold horde of previously unknown barbarians appeared. Fearful bearded savages, from the lands of Jutland and Frisia, then began a mass migration in a southern and southwestern direction. Previously, the Romans with Germanic tribes practically did not encounter and had little interest in the Germans, being separated from them, Celtic, layer. The first close acquaintance cost the Republic extremely expensive. In 113 BC, numerous tribes of Cimmers and Teutons reached the Danube and invaded the Celtic lands of modern Austria. The Roman army under the command of the consul Gnaeus Carbone blocked their way to Rome through the Alps, trying to protect the people of Norici, friendly to the Republic. However, the Romans overestimated their strength. The army of Gnaeus Carbonus was defeated, and the Cimmers turned west to Helvetia, uniting with the surrounding tribes. The negotiations between the Cimbrians and the consul Marcus Junius Silanus, which began in 109 BC, failed. The barbarians demanded recognition of their conquered territories and even agreed to fight for the Republic. Either out of reluctance to give up fertile lands or out of disagreement with the defeat in the war, the Republican Senate did not accept these terms. In the same year, Silanus's army was also defeated by barbarians in Gaul. The Republic suffered its next defeat in 107 BC. This time the allies of the Cimmers, the tribe of Helvets, destroyed the army of consul Lucius Cassius. But even these military setbacks in front of a numerically superior enemy were not as crushing for Rome as the subsequent Battle of Araucione in 105 BC. To stop and repel the united barbarians, the armies of the proconsul Quintus Servilius Caepio and the consul Gnaeus Malleus Maximus were sent to meet them. The commanders did not unite their forces because of personal dislike for each other, which also contributed significantly to the pitiful results of the battle. As a result of the first clash, the detachment of legate Marcus Aurelius Scaurus was defeated. The legate himself was captured and killed. Commanding the army of barbarians, the young leader Boiaric tried to negotiate with consul Maximus, which, however, did not bring results. According to historians, in the Battle of Araucione killed from 60 to 80,000 legionnaires plus up to 40,000 carriers. Such an unthinkable defeat Rome has never experienced. Unseen aliens from the northeast were tall, strong and tireless, their hair was straw-bright, and Italians told as if the children of barbarians gray, like old men. After the Battle of Araucione all Italy was open to invasion, and the Romans were seized with a terror such as they had not experienced since the Punic Wars. Every citizen of the Republic had to rise to her defense. Orders were sent all along the coast and to all the ports of Rome forbidding men under 25 years of age to board ships. An oath was taken from the young men that they would not leave Italy. Second consul Publius Rutilius Rufus began to hastily form a new, last army. On the other hand, and the forces of the barbarians were no longer sufficient to continue the offensive to the south, the tribes were divided and dispersed across Europe. It is worth noting that not only the Romans suffered from the war with the Cimbrians. The devastation of Gaul by unexpected guests forced many Celtic tribes to seek an alliance with the Eternal City. As a result of monstrous losses, Cimmers and Teutons successively defeated 5 Roman armies. The new army of the Republic had to be formed almost from scratch. With the threat of barbarian invasion, to prepare a sufficient number of skillful soldiers was difficult in itself, and given the existing census, to prepare them was no longer from whom. Human resources were almost completely exhausted. As a result, the Senate had to go for cardinal reforms of the Republican army, proposed by Consul Gaius Marius. Mari laid the foundation for reforming the army by abolishing the main archaism, the property tax. People who had no land or money were now eager to join the army. Using it as a social elevator, they got a job with a fixed salary and good career opportunities, albeit unsafe. And if they were lucky and 25 years of service ended successfully, they could expect a reward from the state in the form of a plot of land. Of course, in the conditions of continuous wars it was difficult to live up to the pension, but outside the army there were no prospects for a secure old age anyway. The downside of the reform was a huge burden on the state budget. People who could not provide themselves with weapons and equipment flocked to the professional army. All expenses fell on the Republic's treasury. Training of new recruits had to take place within a year. Introduced a centralized provision of uniform equipment and weapons. The Roman army began to rapidly acquire a well-known image. Moreover, it was Gaius Marius who introduced the Roman eagle as a symbol of the legion. Reform was also subjected to the organization of the legions. Fully staffed legion included 6,000 people, 5,200 of whom were fighters. The others were non-combat escorts. The legion was divided into 10 cohorts of 600 men, those, on 6 centuria. Continuing the gradation, the centuria was divided into groups of 10 men contemporanea. These small groups were to become the most cohesive, platoons, because people had to fight shoulder to shoulder. For this purpose, the principle of in camp and on the march was used. The soldiers lived and ate together even on the breaks. Due to the fact that each unit carried with them all the equipment and things, the army became more mobile. Maria's reform allowed the Republic to create a permanent professional army of well-trained and equipped soldiers, instead of the previous militia, which was called up when needed. Standing under the banners with the eagle, the new symbol of the Roman legions, the army was ready to glorify Rome again. Loud victories. And long to choose a target for this did not have to. After the victory in the Jugurtha War in North Africa, Marius returned to Rome. By this time, over Rome again hovered the threat of invasion. The Cimbrians, who had gone to Spain, did not stay there for long. Having been repulsed by the local tribes, they united with some Gauls and Ambrones and decided to conquer Italy. Marius, leading the army he had created, was the first to meet and defeat the Teutons on the road to Rome. At about the same time, in the northeastern Alps, the consul Quintus Lutatius Catullus was defeated by the Cimmers. He had to conclude a truce with the barbarians for the winter and leave the north of Italy to them to plunder. In 101 BC, Gaius Marius was again elected consul and continued his military campaign. Combining his army with the remnants of Catullus' troops, he decides to give a general battle to end the barbarians once and for all. The Germans suffered their first major defeat at Aquae Sectium in the summer of 102 BC. According to various estimates, from 100 to 200,000 Germans were killed. The exterminated tribe of Teutons forever disappears from history, but its name remains as generalizing for all Germanic peoples of the future. The final battle of the war took place in July 101 BC at Wurzel. The armies lined the field, and, according to the testimony of contemporaries, the Cimmers stood in a square, the side of which reached about 5 Roman miles. Perhaps this is just an exaggeration of ancient authors, but even the figures on losses are quite impressive. In the battle fell from 65 to 100,000 Cimbrians. In addition to soldiers, with the Roman legions fought and women of the Germans. Let's give the floor to Lucius Annaeus Florus, a Roman historian of the I century AD. The battle with the wives of the barbarians was no less brutal than with the barbarians themselves. They fought with axes and pikes, putting the carts in a circle and climbing on top of them. Their deaths were as impressive as the battle itself. When the embassy sent to Marius failed to secure their freedom and inviolability, there was no such custom. They strangled their children or tore them to pieces, and themselves, wounding each other and making loops of their own hair, hanged themselves from trees or from the cart's axles. The outcome of the Kimvrian War is well known. The barbarians were almost completely destroyed. The threat of Germanic invasion was eliminated, which became the guarantee of prosperity and the golden age of the empire. This danger will reappear only 400 years later. But the main consequence of the Cimmerian invasion was the most rapid reform of the armed forces in history and the creation of a fundamentally new army of Rome with very significant consequences for the entire world history, from the Romanization of the newly acquired territories and ending with the triumphal campaigns of the legions over the English Channel and the Tigris and Euphrates. But all this will happen in the future. Gaius Marius himself in 107 BC hardly imagined that under the influence of extraordinary circumstances he invented a universal formula by which the armies of many other states were formed centuries and millennia later.